Morning, everybody. Happy it's about bloody time day. And welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by Labour's Shadow Veterans Minister, Stephanie Peacock. Morning, Stephanie.
Morning. Hiya.
So this is the People's Paper Review, remember? So get into the comments, ask us your questions. The best ones will come up on the screen, and the best ones, hopefully, we'll get a news agenda mug. And also, for those of you who are watching and are worried that your boss will suddenly find you're not doing your work, you can catch up later on podcasts on Spotify and iTunes. So what have we got today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on a request that today's spring statement by the Chancellor help out struggling families. But we're not going to discuss that because it hasn't happened yet and because this is my show. So instead, we're going to do a story that I've been trying to write for the past 20 years. Now, regular viewers will know that I report on the Mirror's campaign for recognition of the men who took part in our Cold War nuclear weapons test. And now we've finally uncovered the proof that successive governments suppressed their own report showing that they were at more risk of radiogenic cancers and early death. In normal times, this would be a contender for the front, but I'm not bitter. Thanks to Rishi and Mr. Putin, we need to dive into page 29, and there would be no page 30 without it, so let's not worry about that. In 1983, nuclear test veterans worldwide first began telling their story, and Ken McGinley of Johnston near Glasgow started a campaign group that 2 years later won the promise of a government health study. When it was published in 1988, it was 7 pages long and concluded there was no overall risk to health for test veterans, apart from slight risk of leukemia. But we've now discovered that hidden in the footnotes to that study was a 140-page pile of extra data, which found, in fact, they were 3 times more likely to die from it. That's a statistically significant finding and in no way a slight risk. And this report was never published. It never existed in physical form. And in fact, if you click on the links in the online version of our story, you will probably be one of the first people to ever see what the government knew 34 years ago. Now, Steph, you obviously weren't part of this or part of the governments at the time, but Labour has been in power during the years when this report was being suppressed, if that's the right word, when ministers may have perhaps misled the House of Commons, Tory and Labour, about its contents. Perhaps they never knew about it either, never got to see it. Are we being dramatic? Is this a cover-up, or has the Mirror got the wrong end of the stick here?
I think the Mirror is doing really important work and has done since the 1980s. You know, it's incredibly important that we get to the bottom of the situation. And, you know, activists, journalists, lawyers did not know about these companion reports. And indeed, you know, we've only sort of uncovered them in the last few weeks. And I've put down some parliamentary questions to ask both the Cabinet Office and the MOD what they knew and when.
Exactly. And what did they say? You've filed these parliamentary questions and said, where is report R214? How many copies of it have you got? What do they say?
Not a lot at the moment.
No, they're basically saying that it's too expensive to go and look for it because it wasn't online, so they can't be bothered. Now, keep ask us your questions, everybody. What do you think about this story? What do you think the government should do? Do you think that radiation risks are something we should be worrying about, considering there's a war in Ukraine? And our main concern is that the aggressor has nuclear weapons. Not that I'm asking you leading questions there or anything. Now, one of the key points in this report, in this study, is that in 2007, the government was sued by a group of 1,011 test veterans. And their lawyers went through strict security vetting by the MOD, of the kind usually given to special forces and ministers, developed vetting it's called, in order to see confidential files. They never saw this report, never got shown it. And in August 2008, government lawyers filed a High Court defence of the claim, which stated for the first time that 159 men who flew sampling missions through the nuclear clouds were possibly irradiated. And we reported on that in 2008. And it was a big admission at the time. But this document we found, Steph, shows that the government by that point had known for 20 years The true figure was not 159. The true figure of the men at risk of radiation was 2,314. So did the government lie to the High Court?
I honestly don't know the answer to that, but I think it's incredibly important we find out what the answer is. And successive governments clearly do have questions to answer. This goes back decades.
Yeah, it goes back an awfully long way. I would have thought that the lawyers and the people involved in that court case would want to go back and have a look at the statement of defence which the Ministry of Defence filed, because it very clearly states that only 159 were at any risk. It makes a brief mention of a few groups of test veterans who may have had a very teeny tiny dose. Certainly doesn't say 2,314 men were on high risk missions, which is what they knew by that point. Now, good morning, everybody, and thank you for all the good mornings that we're getting in the comments. Susan says, she's the daughter of a test veteran, by the way, everyone. It's about time the government stop lying and give the veterans the medal that they deserve. Help their families that are suffering. Help them. Now, there's this thing, isn't there, Steph, about a medal? I mean, the Mirror's been campaigning on this since 2018 because we always thought that asking for compensation and proof of cover-up and stuff like this, until we had the proof of a cover-up, there was no point in doing that. It wasn't going to get us anywhere. It would just get us knocked back. So we asked for the medal because we thought that was the easiest ask, and we'd get a fairly quick answer, and we might get something for the veterans before they die, because the average age of them is 81. Does it feel now like a medal is enough?
No, I don't think it does. And I'm actually quite surprised by the response I've had in the House of Commons when I've asked about nuclear test veterans, because I think the medal is sort of the least that the government can do. We obviously need recognition, we need support, we need an investigation to the situation, and we we do need to consider compensation.
Exactly. It's one of those things, isn't it, that it just seems completely obvious, really, in any regard. But if you go to a government and say, we want compensation, a medal, and this and that and the other, and they go, that's too much, we're not going to ask that, which is why we went for a medal. But it does start to look now like we could be perhaps entitled to a bit more, and have the evidence to show that we're entitled to a bit more. Now, keep asking us your questions. What do you think about the government suppression of this report? Do you think it was suppressed? Do you think it was just something that happened and was filed away and just naturally forgotten about? I'm not a big one for saying there are conspiracies, because I think, Steph, usually there's just far too many people involved for there to be conspiracies. They always fall apart very quickly if you do have one.
I don't think we know yet, but it's important we find out.
Yeah, it does seem like something went wrong here, because there was an ISBN number for this report, and we checked with the stationery office, and it's never been published. It's never existed in physical form anywhere, as far as we know, possibly within the NRPB, the National Radiological Protection Board, which conducted the first study. But until they want to tell us if they've got a hard copy, we're not going to know that for sure. So what we do know, though, is that since 1988, there have been numerous war pension hearings, court cases, parliamentary debates, numerous mirror stories where we've gone to the MOD for right of reply and comments and response, spoken to ministers and so on. And for 34 years, all those governments had ample opportunity to announce that this data actually existed. And it never, ever, ever did until last month, when an update to the original study was published. And for the first time, some of these, what they're called companion reports, were published alongside them, some of which had been previously available and some weren't. Now, this 1988 one was very difficult to find, because it was referenced in the original 7-page summary only in the footnotes, and only then as a description of the methods used, not in terms of saying there's extra data here, or there's more stuff to see, or this is where all the detail is, just as these are our methods. So no one thought to look at it. The only way of finding that report also was if you knew the code on the front of the report. So the front page says it's got a code R214, and that's the reference that's in the footnotes. And the only way to know what the code of that report was if you'd already seen the report, which is Kafkaesque in a way. But Steph, if Labour was in power, what could it do about all this? Because it does look like we need a full public inquiry to get to the bottom of some of this. It shouldn't be left up to idiots like me, should it?
Well, I think the Mirror's done incredibly important work, and I was, really taken aback when we spoke a few weeks ago about the companion report. And I think, a good government could do a number of things. They could sort of shine a light on what has happened in sort of decades gone by and what governments have known. They can also put the sort of money, the research, and the sort of power of government behind, you know, supporting nuclear test veterans, and they can be, you know, they can give them the recognition that they deserve, both in compensation but also in a medal. And we are the only government that hasn't done that, and I think that is a really bad state to be in.
Yeah, I mean, if it's something that the Americans, the Australians, the New Zealanders, the French, the Russians, the Chinese all seem happy to be able to recognise their nuclear veterans in some way, whether it's with a war pension or a medal or something else, it seems bizarre that we're not, put it that way. Alan, who is leader of a campaign group and whose father died from the nuclear tests, his brother also died early from heart disease linked to the tests, and his sister has been ill as well with it. He says, thank you, Stephanie, for all your help with our Look Me in the Eye campaign. And like this evidence, how can we hold the government to account? What can we do next? Because, I mean, we've got Labour's support, but what do we do now?
Well, I think we need the government to look them in the eye, that we need the government to meet the nuclear test veterans. And I know that a number of colleagues across the House have been pushing them to do that. We're trying to get a debate in Parliament on it. We're asking questions. We've got defence questions on Monday. I'm hoping that we can ask it again at that. We just need to keep putting the government under pressure. And I think their response has changed slightly, whereas they just sort of were very dismissive and were sort of like, oh, well, you know, it's independent of us, which actually that's a separate story. It's not independent. I feel like they are moving slightly, and we need to make sure that we sort of put them under pressure and we hold them to account. Yeah,
because the very reason that, as I said to you the other day when we met, the very reason that we are not currently concerned that Vladimir Putin is going to fling his nuclear weapons at us is because these men helped create our nuclear deterrent. They are as relevant now as they've ever been.
Yeah, and I think that's an incredibly powerful point.
Yeah, the fact that they're still keeping us safe and we're letting them rot like this is, I think, well, it's morally abhorrent, but there we go. Now, we'll have to sort of wait and see how things pan out later on today. I think there may be some reference in Prime Minister's questions later on, which the Mirror will be carrying live on these Facebook pages at 12 o'clock. So do tune in and see what happens there. And if you have an MP and you want to get them involved in this, or if you've got any connection to the test, by all means, write to them and see what else we can, what else they can do about it. If you've got a Tory MP in particular, be quite handy to put some pressure on them. Alan says again, Leo Doherty, who's the Veterans Minister, Steph, your opposite number, wrote to me and told me that the UK is the best place to be a veteran. It's clearly not. Is it a good place to be a veteran?
We want it to be, and I think it's, you know, it's a very powerful slogan, isn't it? And we can all get behind that. But the government's sort of rhetoric and their action simply don't marry up. You know, we saw that with the veteran strategy, or the so-called veteran strategy, a few months ago. There's so much we can do to support our fantastic veterans, and we're not doing it.
Yeah, and there's also big problems, aren't there, with this medal committee that I know you've been looking into. So a few years ago, after part of the nuclear veterans campaign, we managed to convince the Defence Secretary to set up a medal review for the veterans. And as a result, there's this medal committee now, part of the honours system, which has also looked at medals for other historic claims. And they seem to have turned down all of them, Steph. Now that's bizarre. You'd think there'd be one out of those groups that might be due one. And, you know, what can we do about that?
Well, when I was quite early into the job, I asked a question on this and they sort of said, oh, well, it's independent. And I initially just like took, oh, okay, well, fine, it's independent. And then literally after the questions, I looked into it a little bit and it's not independent. You know, most of the people on the committee have some form of link to the MOD. And those that I've spoken to are incredibly disappointed about what's happened over the last decade, because there was a promise of a review to this situation. And I think we do need to look again at it.
Yeah, exactly. I know when that committee was set up, we were very keen to try and get a historian on it, an independent historian. Nope, we've got someone who ran MOD budgets.
Before I did this job, I was a history teacher, and I absolutely agree. Of course, we need a historian on this, and we need a variety of independent representatives.
Yeah. They need to have specialists that can come in and out of that committee, depending on which kind of medal they're discussing.
Yeah,
and say, absolutely. Yes, I know about this one. I know about that one.
There needs to be some flexibility. So I think there needs to be a variety of people, a historian, all sorts of different people. But there needs to be flexibility, as you absolutely say, depending on what they're looking at. They can speak to the relevant expert.
Yeah, that would make sense, wouldn't it? Rather than someone who's been in charge of accountancy at the Ministry of Defence, which spends £1 billion on a spanner. And, medals are not decided on the basis of how much they cost, last time I checked. Now, Steve, who's the son of a test veteran, he was at Maralinga in Australian outback, where they conducted 593 highly toxic and horrible radiation experiments. Says, if this information had been public years ago, research and medical assistance for veterans and families could have been in place by now. This is the thing, isn't it, Steph? Since 1988, people like Steve have been born with birth defects, with problems. There's widows who've lost their husbands. There are people who've been treated for cancer. There are parents who've lost children to 5 times the normal rate of infant mortality in test veterans. That's the thing. There's no way to fix it, because all that horror has happened.
And my heart goes out to everyone affected, and it's a devastating situation. And as you said at the start of the programme, like, the average age is 81, and that's why it's so imperative that we act, quickly. But it doesn't take away from all the families that are affected as well.
Yeah. And bear in mind, whenever you hear anybody this year, folks, talk about the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, 70 years on the throne, it's also the Plutonium Jubilee, 70 years since the very first nuclear test, Operation Hurricane, in October 1952. So the reason that she's had such a nice, long, peaceful reign is in part because of the nuclear deterrent, which has kept us safe from war ever since. Anyway, keep asking us your questions. We do need to get onto a couple of other things. So onto further war crimes, if you like. And in Ukraine, there are reports that Russian soldiers are laying mines in areas that they've taken, perhaps in preparation for losing them again soon. Yeah, you smug git, smile away. Sorry for the sake of the podcast listeners. There's a picture of Vladimir Putin just popped up on the screen. He looks like Dobby the house elf's just done a big poo in someone's shoe. So they're mining areas, and that means that more civilians and children will die and be injured in horrific circumstances when people sort of remain there, civilians remain there. And it's being reported that rather than negotiating for peace or this war becoming a busted flush, Putin's forces are actually reaching stalemate with Ukraine now. Ukraine is running out of anti-tank weapons. According to the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, so is Britain, so we can't send them any more for a bit. And Russia's digging in for a long haul, which will involve perhaps obliterating cities slowly over time, rather than actually having a quick end to the fighting. But Steph, what's your reading of this situation? Because a week ago, it looked like Putin couldn't sustain this much longer. There was no food, there were no supplies to his troops on the front line, there was lots of desertions. Does he have the supplies and the troops to keep doing this?
I don't know the answer to that, but I mean, it's absolutely devastating, the situation that we find ourselves in. And I think, I attended an event a couple of days ago where someone from the military sort of said, we can be shocked, but we shouldn't be surprised by the situation given his actions over the last decade. And I think, it's incredibly upsetting and very worrying.
Yeah, I have to sort of wait and see how it goes. But there's been suggestions that that Russia could start negotiating peace, but they're going for this position of just wanting everything. We'll have peace if you give us everything we want, which isn't really much of a negotiating position. And Ukraine, of course, doesn't want to give them everything they want. But so there's no serious talks, it would seem, going on. And while they're talking about talks, Russia is blowing stuff up. So maybe they're playing for time. But very quickly, Steph, I wanted to ask you as well. There's a piece on the left-hand side of the paper that, hang on, I've got a question for Maria. Let's do this first. It's a big one. There are so many reports that have been buried, so much we don't know. This is the tip of the iceberg. Recently, the Russia report, the Ford report, COVID Iraq, so many cover-ups buried by various governments. Public inquiries take so long. It's an uphill struggle. This is a travesty and needs a higher profile. Major press involvement. It stinks of a cover-up. Test veterans all over the world need recognition. Good luck with Plutonium Jubilee, should be in everyone's lips. Thank you, Maria. That's one of the things which kind of plays in the test veterans' favour in a way, is that it's the same story for people who are at American tests in the Pacific and in Nevada, in Russian tests in Kazakhstan, in Chinese tests in the steppes, in the tests that took place in Australia. It's not just our guys reporting this, is it? There seems to be a phenomenon at work, and the government's never said, if it's not radiation, what else it could be that's giving them these high rates of leukemia.
Yeah,
And
and
birth defects.
I'm still taken aback by the response. The response that says, "Oh, actually, they have a better life expectancy than the general population." It's astounding, really. Particularly, if you look at particularly the research that the Mirror have done with all of the different risks to health, not just to the test veterans themselves, but to their children and their children's children.
Yeah. Now, there's something called part of the study. This is actually something I heard from the UK Health Security Agency, which now has responsibility for doing these studies. Yesterday, when we went to them for a comment, they said that overall, the test veterans were healthier than the general population. They were less likely to have cancer and die. And this is entirely true. It's also entirely true that if you have a gammy leg, you don't get signed up to the military in the first place. And this gives rise to something that's known as the healthy soldier effect. So the study was designed intentionally between a group of soldiers and another group of soldiers, test veterans and some other people in the forces at the same time, because they're both selected for being the healthiest people in Britain. Young men, top of their game, 18 years old, okay? And furthermore, because they were all serving in the tropics, they were selected for the healthiest out of that group to actually go to the tests or to go to Korea or Malaya or wherever the other group was. So we would expect that group of individuals to be healthier than the average member of the public. Because, you and me, Steph, if you've got short sight or a funny leg or a limp or you're not very well, you've got asthma, you don't go to these places in the first place. And I was trying to explain to the UK Health Security Agency, Stephanie, I was trying to explain this to them, that the shocking thing is that these incredibly healthy veterans have the same rate of death or very similar to the rest of us, because that's the weird bit. And they were using that as the defense. I find that astonishing.
Yeah. It is. I mean, I think the whole thing is astonishing. Absolutely. You're absolutely right.
There's no other way of saying it quite. About the fact the UK Health Security Agency doesn't quite understand the sciences. I mean, I'm not perfect at it, but Jiminy, even I figured that one out. Susan says, we're the biggest experiment going. You're very well monitored group of veterans, but children like Susan, not monitored for their health outcomes. They could be quite easily. Now, we do have, so that's the thing I wanted to ask you very quickly, Steph. Sorry, we got moved off the topic. There is a little stick on the side there about Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, being hoaxed by a couple of Russian pranksters. And there is a little trailer of it has appeared on YouTube, and there's going to be apparently a full interview. Now, the Defence Secretary says this is a bit doctored, and he soon spotted they were not who they were claiming to be, the Ukrainian Defence Prime Minister, I think, and he ended the call. But Steph, just as an aside, I mean, you aim to be in government one day. If your aides say, here's a call from so-and-so and put it through to you, there's not very much you can do. Has he made a boo-boo here, or is this just something that's going to happen these days?
I think it's incredibly difficult, and I think it is much more prevalent than perhaps that we realise. So, for example, I met a company in Barnsley on Friday. They're a double glazing company. They're pretty successful, and they had sustained a cyber attack, and that had been very difficult for them, and it had cost them a huge amount of money. And they're like, we are a successful company, but we are not a big state company. We are not particularly high profile, and so I think this goes on a huge amount, and we need to be aware and alert to it.
A double glazing company in Barnsley, Putin, if you're watching, stop it. You're taking it to ridiculous levels now, because they're really not going to. What are you thinking? Whoever's working in St. Petersburg in the troll factory needs to rein the lads in a bit, because they're going off piste. Now, we do have some other news to get to. Now, keep asking us your questions. We'll wrap up at the end. What do you think about the test veterans and the suppression of this report? What do you think should be done? What do you think Labour could do differently? Have you got any questions for Steph about Ukraine or prank calls for defence secretaries? Get in the comments. Let us know. But first off, there is some good news in the world, and it's got its shirt off. Here it is. Now, during the first lockdown, many of us turn to bonk-busting Bridgerton to alleviate the boredom, and fans will be delighted to know not only is it back, but it involves beautiful girls and handsome men in wet cotton shirts and tight breeches, which are my favourite type of men. Now, Steph, you watched this the first time, didn't you? How did you find it?
I did, and I accidentally watched it with my mom. You like a period drama, Mom? Let's tune into this. It wasn't quite what I was expecting.
You expected some Jane Austen, were you?
Yeah, that's exactly that's what I thought, but it wasn't quite what
No, I think the opening scene involved a bare bottom up against a tree, as I recall. That one's probably emblazoned on your memory and your mother's. What a shame. But it does seem like we're about ready for a bit more escapism because, you know, the first time the first season came out, we were all locked in our homes because of a deadly disease and the world seemed like a terrible place. It's actually managed to get a bit worse. So is season 2 going to alleviate it a bit, do you think?
I hope so. I'll be tuning in to find out.
Yeah, hopefully without your mum this time.
Yeah, without my mum.
Hopefully alone.
I'll let her know it's coming.
Yeah, tell her she can watch it by herself. Perhaps this is going to be the one sanction that will really bite on Russia as well. All those Muscovites desperate for season 2 and the shot of Anthony with his shirt off. But Netflix has cancelled Russia. So maybe this will actually have an impact on those oligarchs and all their families. Who knows? That would be nice to see, wouldn't it? Right. Thank you for joining us, Steph. We're going to have to let you go and get on with your important business. Thank you for taking part, everybody. Catch up again later on podcast on Spotify or iTunes. And we'll see you all again next Monday for another edition of the News Agenda. Bye-bye.